Enter attention. What the Chinese Jordan Peterson teaches us about attention and influence today. Jiang is a unique character on the stage of attention. In a tremendously short period of time, he has become an influential commentator on geopolitics and power more broadly, catapulting to prominence thanks in part to his predictions and analysis on the Iran war. He has spoken with Tucker Carlson, Alexander Dugin, the famous Gen Z streamer Sneeko, Piers Morgan, Jimmy Dore, Dave Smith, Mehdi Hassan, and many others. Voices across the ideological, geopolitical, and generational spectrum, tens of millions reached through others' platforms alone. Nominally, he's a Chinese high school teacher, though not a full citizen of China, who grew up in Canada and graduated from Yale with a bachelor's degree in English literature. He is a widely read, tremendously effective communicator, at least as judged on the merit of the number of people tuning in. He's also something of an epistemic cowboy and appears several steps ahead of most of the higher attention commentariat in describing patterns of power at play in the wild, wild world. He plays fast and loose, but he's also ready to stand and deliver. Of course, I'd like to see Jiang encounter more penetrating, challenging, genuine depth in conversation, but the lack of such is hardly a marker of his irrelevance as a figure of influence. In fact, I believe Jiang has been one of the more interesting influences on popular currents of the zeitgeist. His image used for a shocking number of long-form deepfakes in an uncanny parasitical testament to his algorithmic value. Jiang's prominence allows us to describe shifting dynamics of attention today, along with several ways by which the attentional field is subject to influence. My focus is here, and much less on the specifics of Jiang's sometimes wild simplifications and contentious readings of science, philosophy, and history. The content I've engaged most, in addition to his high-profile guest appearances, is his ongoing series titled Game Theory, which focuses on current world events. Yes, Jiang's philosophy and interpretation of life and history informs his current world analysis, and I have not ignored it in the development of what follows. But the genesis of this piece came out of preparation to host a Culture Lab session for the Voicecraft Network, which explicitly invites a context for deepening understanding of critical higher attention events, people, and dynamics in culture space and the world more generally. So what follows is necessarily more limited in scope than the content of Jiang's lectures. I attempt to look into and through the medium of his influence in order to encourage a more critical and generative address of attention, education, and mutual epistemic responsibility. I remain open to conversation with Jiang, as well as those who are profoundly critical of his commentary on specific domains or more broadly. This isn't a hit piece, but the scope and relevance of the influence and attention in question demands critical address. In such cases where political interests, power, authority of interpretation, and the shadowed workings of each converge at scale, I realize that the very prospect of good faith public conversation is something of a Trojan unicorn, at least among those so embroiled in death grips of victory over wisdom more open to the anti-rivalrous value of trust and faith. Yet, as long as we're honest that attempts to move toward authentic relation in such charged territories of public discrimination will be accompanied at least by some naivety and suspicion, we can come to have a measure of sympathy for any who make the effort. Chapter 1. The Man and the Meme. Before looking into the dynamics of attention through the figure of Jiang more explicitly, there are a few things I find interesting about the challenge of approaching what's really real here. Taken together, they function as a meta-reflection on epistemic responsibility, ethics, and engagement with the zeitgeist from the perspective of collaborative understanding. The core challenge is to do with navigating the tangle between what I often think about as the man and the meme. One might say the person and the idea, but really the living history of who a person really is, what they really stand for, and the ways in which they are and are not open to relationship in the intimate present of their being in the world. This as distinct from, but connected to, the various ways that ideas, projections, interpretations, etc. influence our perception of, in this case, a person, but also the context of relevance more broadly. A good amount of engagement at the level of culture war tends to care little for the person, preferring for reasons of strategy and self-protection from real contact with others to take up battle in the domain of meme, quick to turn men to straw, quick to interpret voice as grift, or at least judge the person as indistinguishable from the ideology or thought form they are seen to, and may in fact, play host to. For the sake of empathy and integrity, I generally prefer to address the person rather than the meme alone. Empathy and integrity are far from soft and floppy morals. They have direct epistemic value. And how else to really participate in a more fully enriched context for understanding? But if knowing people at all can be difficult, then in the era of mass attention, engaging both man and meme can be particularly challenging. But real relationship, authentic encounter, can be barred for reasons worth more and less respect. Virtue is implicated in the bearing, in the function of our membranes. And I see a great load of bullshit compromising federation between people and networks due to low-quality gatekeeping, narrow self-interest, and poor discernment about the communicational field more generally, all of which ends up perverting the potential for positive sum alignment. But then, of course, there are also those who engage deceitfully, with wickedness of intent. In such cases, it's perverse and foolish to cede mimetic ground in hopes of first encountering something of more open, collaborative soul. Whether the bleeding heart to the intelligence operative, the credulous crowd to the sharp-tongued mentalist, Celebrimbor, smith of the many rings, to Sauron in the guise of Anatar who seeks control of the one and only, discounting or ignoring the mimetic territory already influencing the conditions of possibility for mutual good faith relating, may as well be to step before the sorcerer with a pair of chopsticks for a wand, expecting noodles. So in my view, we cannot, if we care about increasing value for the commons, and particularly when venturing beyond already established bounds of trust, ignore the call of integrity that summons conscience to treat the person of address well. Nor can we ignore the mimetic spells and ideologies influencing our perception. We must of course call them to question, for they influence the condition of possibility for deeper meeting. Nor indeed can we ignore the entangled field of relationality that more properly constitutes the basis for real receptivity to change, and which we influence, whichsoever way we treat the man or the meme. There's a great mess to all of this, but there's no way to become or return through real encounter with the edge of understanding without transformation that engages the messy. Risk is part of that way, and what we speak, meme, where we speak from, personhood, and the reception in which that meaning finds animation, field, all matter. The fact we come to recognize this long after the process has already begun, that we come to learn about the always already meanings which shape the flowing, changing forms we take up in life, not from some isolated place of control, some view from nowhere, some disconnected sense of transcendence, but very much in the thick of things, seems to be a necessary condition for the quality of any drama. Contingency. Surprise. Chapter 2. Mass Attention, Brainwashing, Authority, and the Alien. One thing to notice about Jiang is the affect of authority with which he speaks. It's not a coincidence he's often called Professor Jiang, despite holding no university or college position. The title professor is apparently a term of respect in China, irrespective of institutional formality, and it's become part of his titular character on the stage of attention. Personally, I'm not one for university monopoly on epistemic authority. These are institutions of waning credibility, particularly as relates to the humanities, in so many ways. But I don't say that triumphantly, and I see no sign that the number of views on a video confers any comparable credibility on the strength of his attentional algorithmic achievement alone. And it is through YouTube, of course, on the Predictive History channel, where Jiang shares his lectures on world affairs, literature and history to 2.4 million plus subscribers, all of which are apparently recorded in the classroom of a Beijing high school, the Moonshot Academy. I was initially skeptical of the truth of that setting, despite his calling on a few select students to occasionally take the mic and read some quotes. And yet, going back more than a decade, Jiang appears on video speaking with passion on the subject of education during his time co-leading a unique and somewhat revolutionary schooling program in China, long before his commentary on any of the above. I perceive the discussion to be sincere and authentic. Many of his lectures receive millions of views within days, and the podcast circuit has taken note. He speaks from a basis which projects received or expert authority across many topics. These he presents in near all-encompassing pictures of how the world works. Many of the patterns he identifies are compelling, clearly presented, and often touch on topics and home truths which sit on the very edge of the pre-COVID Overton window, too far for typical Western commentators who speak from similarly perceived institutional contexts, by which I mean the aesthetic of the classroom at whatever level of education. The context of this transmission must not be overlooked, and it's a point we will return to. Jiang professes many thoughts on education which I take to be meaningfully more progressive, in the sense of better, than traditional modern forms based on a human capital approach to schooling. But it's his mode of delivery I draw to attention first. In his lectures, you'll frequently hear theories advanced as speculation, yet presented as authoritative, delivered in a manner that's precisely akin to the mode of fact-based learning that Jiang himself speaks critically of, and which most of us were conditioned from a young age to expect. Trivia, rote memorization, knowledge cramming. There's a contradiction here. Jiang is highly capable, as evidenced by the scale of his audience, at presenting non-conventional ideas in conventional frequencies of expression. At the level of the idea, Jiang brings a generalist breadth to accompany his straightforward style of delivery, which is uncommon to the surface-level commentariat. But the delivery itself, an extension of his epistemic presence in the world, indicates he places less prioritization on the quality of participation or metabolization with the content he shares as compared to the broadcast impact of his perspective. That is the contradiction. On the one hand, a denouncement of brainwash by broadcast. On the other, no meaningful movement beyond that mode, despite the declaration of aspiration to do so. Put another way, and with respect to the medium of his lectures specifically, I perceive his contact with students and listeners, as an educator, to stay in the mode of propositional delivery. The ideas and contentions are often confrontational, impactful, but the presence of genuine receptivity on Jiang's part seems to me lacking, like he doesn't really want the contact in office hours, though he well might. My point is that the transmission conveys an affect of one-way projection, more akin to mimetic spellcasting rather than expression conveyed to stoke an atmosphere of mutual learning. Mutual learning is a phrase that's become second nature to me, such as the importance of our contextual, processual, dynamic, transmembranic, and relational entanglement with each other. Nora Bateson has been most influential in its spread over many years. It appears in her book Combining, as well as more formally in her term symathesy, referring to the characteristic of living systems, best described as mutual learning. The term symathesy is a combination of the Greek prefix sym, meaning together, combined with the Greek word mathesy, meaning learning. This may not strike as an obvious critique. In one way it's tremendously subtle, and I doubt it's a standard that the majority of listeners, or even Jiang himself, would see as necessary to hold to, and honestly I would have loved him as a teacher at high school. Indeed, it's mostly par for the course in terms of teaching style. And there's value there in terms of brute dissemination of perspective. But it remains a point that I hold has important implications for the general observations and contentions I share in this essay. There are reasonable questions to ask in response. What would it mean to educate at the level of the idea in a mode more deeply rooted than propositional force alone? Can educators aspire to more than a battle of abstraction in the digital arena? For now, I offer this perception on Jiang's mode of delivery as an essential shade, which helps us more accurately colour in the contours of his sharp rise to attentional prominence. Mass attention wants content that lands again and again, with authority, with self-certainty, and with contextual through-lines that present the true alienness of that which lurks in the cracks or edges of our maps in a deceptively comforting way. a way which turns the salience of potential other into something formulaic, mimetically nameable, category safe, a story to stimulate the present context of perception rather than something we must step into another world to see. For an educator who strives for an epistemology and praxis that incorporates more than just propositional knowing and engagement, see the work of John Vervaeke, who distinguishes propositional knowing from the perspectival, processual, and participatory. Chapter 3. Mass Attention, Salience and Impotence-Making. Although the Iran War compounded mass interest in Jiang, he is perhaps most well known for the candor and boldness with which he voices salient, taboo ideas in tandem with the societal contexts they implicate. Think Epstein, elite networks, secret societies, the corrosive, predatory nature of transnational finance and capital, trafficking, laundering, religious eschatology and its connection to politics, all of which are so in need of address in our time. Coupled with a general framing of his personal approach to game theory, these are matters which mostly sit a step or two removed from the surface-level topics of pre-COVID politics. Jiang provides historical narratives, lines of logic, and news cycle current media to contextualize these subjects, with the effect of building salient and often coherent frames of explanation, at least for a moment. Frames which the zeitgeist is craving in a time of increasing narrative instability, uncertainty, disintegration, and breakdown of global order. By global order, I mean the norms, rules, interpretive structures, and general stability of power relations that hold expectations and material events in rhythm. All of these appear to be in flux, and there are tens of millions upon tens of millions who are noticing. Good stories are in demand no matter the rocking of an age. And today the age rocks. So enter the next professor who tells compelling stories. Stories of people, plots, and power that popular consciousness demands be told. What's more, this particular prophetary, the Latin root of professor, the one who declares publicly, appears to be sticking his neck out to do so. And in a time where courage to speak is in relatively short supply, despite the chatter. To re-emphasize, Jiang delivers his lines in ways that appeal to the authority transmissions that so many people are accustomed to accepting quite uncritically, the very same received authority signature which itself presides over the breakdown of the world. Despite the copious flaws of our authority structures, the signature of a passionate professor, market in hand, is powerful, comforting, credible. Jiang's thought and the affect that accompanies it is in some ways captivating, soothing, hilarious, dangerous, salacious, revelatory, ordering, and challenging to old structures and patterns, while also being relatively simple in structure when taken in slices. It's chewed for you philosophy, explained like I'm 5 or 15 thinking, or at least the presentation thereof, which I believe plays into the thumos pacifying patterns of content consumption loved by the late-night algorithm. This may be the most concerning risk of Jiang's transmission. It could still hang in the balance, but to the degree the affect of prophecy plays a role in Jiang's public appointment to professorship, then the accompanying degree to which the transmission functions as pacifier and drainage for genuine spirited participation in culture and understanding is a great shame, and indeed a marker of impotence. This has long been my greatest concern with any who integrate occult, conspiratorial, and generally shadowed topics of relevance into the medium of their influence. Are you really calling spirit into participation? Or are you feeding the content mill fragments of truth for the grind, good seed mixed with empty calories that make for impotence, even more so than ignorance? From this perspective, mass attention appears subject to ignorance-making, as well as impotence-making, basins of attraction. Chapter 4. Mass Attention, Images for the Fractured Spirit of Our Time. Yet in addition to these critical concerns, I also take Jiang to be a generative addition to the zeitgeist. His trajectory indicates, yet again, the ascending influence of those who captivate attention in the provision of ideas and information. As I've hinted, on the basis of his lectures alone, I believe he is unlikely to be directly involved in the motivation of deeper participation in understanding. But he is another strong signal of the increasing impotence of legacy media paradigms and their grip on the hermeneutic, interpretive bubbles of public consciousness. The good opinion of experts credentialized by institutions of the 20th century, academia, government, journalism, and so on, can no longer play absolute gatekeeper to narrative deployment. And what's more, new entrants to the stage can draw on the vestiges of old aesthetics to boost their credibility to attention, as long as, I'd guess, they also fulfill something of the idealized projection of what, in this case, education can sometimes, just occasionally, promise itself to be. The revelatory-based professor, someone finally telling you how the world works, with the emphasis, here at least, on tell. Of course, this anti-mainstream institutional line is the same one taken by alternative media platforms for near enough 10 years. And at least on the measure of sheer audience quantity, the sphere of top 20 long-form podcasts and YouTube media outlets are where today's mainstream of listeners under 60 tune in. But I still maintain Jiang's prominence has a certain unique signal to it because of twin factors that hang together: the ideas he contends, and the position, location he speaks from. He's a voice whose traction makes sense in the context of the present attentional era, one defined in terms of fracture, confusion, and shifting alliances that mirror the general deglobalizing shifts in geopolitics. 8 to 10 years ago, although the mass rise in the so-called alternative online was that bit more fresh, a rise which in the end paralleled Trump's success in 2016 and worked to anoint him in 2024, it would be difficult to imagine a voice like Jiang's, one that speaks to conspiracies, cracks, and instabilities in the West so frankly, so matter-of-factly, gaining such traction. Whatever the center of English-speaking alternative popular discourse was online in 2016 to early 2020, there was a certain air, albeit unconscious, of some shared identity structure worth holding to. It seemed to have the binding sense that the threatened yet still beating culture father deep in the belly of the whale could be saved, if only the postmodern neo-Marxist influence could be rooted out. But the rot was and is worse than that. The cracks running both deeper in history, system, and more imminent in the all-too-human embodiment of people, incentives, relations, and leaders today. Jiang, speaking from China, so critical of the West and transnational capital, so authoritative in his prediction of an impending US civil war, implicating as he does various elite networks in destructive complicity in all manner of systems, would have been beyond the pale for the rational discourse of the IDW. The attentional sphere above the fold today holds no such Overton restrictions. Jiang is not the progenitor of many of the salient ideas he shares, but he is a remarkable aggregator and medium for a set of ideas, tensions, and energies which at least the chaotic neutral aspect of the algorithm finds consciousness hooked on today. Mass attention loves images that capture the spirit of our time. Chapter 5. Mass Attention, Epistemics, and Encryption. Now, where I have said that Jiang provides multiple coherent frames for explaining, and by his stated epistemology, predicting global events, it's important to note I don't suggest these frames are presented in ways which are clearly consistent with each other or consistently, rigorously coloured in themselves. In my view of Jiang's world, connections between interpretive maps are sometimes vaguely sketched or ignored, while the colouring in of the maps themselves with supporting content isn't really the primary epistemic interest. It's this lack of attention to consistency and rigour regarding the connections between maps or frames which I think is part of the appeal for attention. And while favouring completeness over consistency is a helpful trade-off in many endeavours, it's a key pole in the epistemic balance that allows for interpretations to attempt to factor anomalies. We must take note here. A basic epistemic point would be to recognize that both underfitting and overfitting to data or experience are natural pitfalls we can slip into. And I'm suggesting that Jiang is something of a cowboy generalist that picks and chooses his specificities. But the point I'm most drawn to make pertains to cognitive dissonance, specifically Jiang's capacity to adopt an air of certainty which minimizes the experience of cognitive dissonance in the minds of his audience. As he moves through and from frame to frame, each as authoritative as the last, whether in lecture or in the dominant mode of Q&A style interview podcast, those which all too often surrender or grift their context to capture some attentionally prominent content, he rarely stops for rigorous dialogue with the contradictions and discontinuities that accompany the tremendous generalizations he makes. For critically, doing so would require more intellectual and energetic bandwidth than attention at scale wishes to expend. Too much pause for doubt breaks the spell, breaks the flow. And that simple observation is worth noting as we consider what attracts and compels attention to aggregate en masse today. While Jiang does remind the listener to challenge him, to be wary again of being brainwashed by him, he delivers even these messages in a way that conveys a propositional legitimacy and epistemic humility without really supporting the praxis for undergoing such. Thus, we can have lectures one week which center the primacy of the causal, if vectoral, influence of eschatology, delivered as if it bore an all-encompassing force of explanatory value. Next, we could receive an argument which has nothing at all to do with eschatology, yet which also claims a kind of explanatory dominance. Perhaps the game theoretic chess of resource control in a period of empire collapse. Then narratives of inter-elite conflict and secret society, Epsteinian, elite network machinations designed to parasitically extract the maximum from a crumbling world. In another lecture, we will get arguments as to great power conflict in an era of multipolarity. Depending on the podcast, different explanatory hats tend to show up. Whatever is more or less on the legitimating, intriguing, or fantastical edge, depending on the stance of the interviewer or the audience at hand. Now, the selection of loose narratives above aren't mutually exclusive explanations, as Jiang would defend. In fact, I take them and many others seriously and advocate becoming accustomed to taking a parallax view in the effort to better make sense of patterns in the world. These subjects Jiang draws on, which are generally less spoken of, are absolutely worth contending with. But again, and for the final time, the mode of presentation does not support a spirit of integration, participation, and critical thinking as a praxis. While there is consistency in the repetition of the endgame, next 10 to 20 years, Jiang points towards a US civil war, an acceleration into the geopolitics of an American technate, Israeli dominance of the Middle East at the behest of transnational elites, world-ending religious wars, the late-stage piracy of a declining empire gradually reshaping geopolitical alliances, the implementation of AI surveillance. These strike me less as epistemically rigorous conclusions and more as competing pitches for the plot of a mind-opening and influential fiction that includes resonant ideas from the zeitgeist writ large. And there's value in that. In fact, I think Jiang would contribute tremendously to the vision of high-budget movies and series. He self-proclaims that core to his epistemology is speculation and imagination, after all. But also, we are told, so too is he known for predictive history, which carries an altogether different flavour of analytic authority, enjoyed far too uncritically as some epistemic method, and which is itself, of course, an idea born of Asimov's fiction. There isn't an epistemics, an ontology, a treatment of complexity science, a metaphysics here that can hold the water of critical participation and mutual learning, though I believe the ideas Jiang shares have something to offer the fold. As such, we have something closer to the transmission of ideas for battle zeitgeist, via lectures which I don't think can claim to prioritize the learning of his students. Off into the world with you, mind expanded or blown with a kaleidoscope of narratives. Fine. But no, the real priority is the audience behind the screen, and the real context of address is the collective imagination. There can be value in that, and where I say that Jiang bears a mark of generative influence on the zeitgeist today, it's because a little more of the other than rational can be crucial for generativity in discourse, particularly if the context of receptivity is sufficiently capable of dialogic mediation in the wake. But the air of analytic certainty and explanatory authority, which is so bound up with Jiang's priming of audience receptivity, should give us pause. The dual-wielding influence of imagination and analysis, without a more participatory, rigorous, clear integration of these modes, should draw us to critical suspicion about what and why the this or that is included or excluded from transmission. Nefarious intent is not a necessary conclusion here, but there is plenty of room for the all-too-human tendency toward bias, bullshit, and self-deception to shape the very conditions of possibility listeners absorb. As long as we stay bound to these dynamics of attention capture without rich participation in understanding, our sense-making will stay brittle, manipulable, and continue to atrophy. Like the salience of heavy-dose psychedelics without integration, reflection, meditation, and embodied contact with the world, shared and supported in relationship, the very keys to liberation will simply lock the prisms of perception to a different encryption. And mass attention loves the affect of an encryption being set free, even as the effect is just another confounding bind. Chapter 6. Mass attention, cracks in the trance. There is another dynamic in the Jiang phenomenon worth re-emphasizing. His stated location in Beijing, China, from which he speaks to an English language audience around the world. I think there's been a gap in the Western empire zeitgeist for a Chinese perspective on world affairs, and we would expect that early voices to truly catch on at scale would need to seem, while not antagonistic toward core Chinese interests, not too clearly aligned either. And Jiang is critical of various Chinese negativities, mostly culturally and spiritually, while also expressing some geopolitical vulnerabilities at the level of resource scarcity and economic strategy that afflict China. But it should be noted, these criticisms are but a fraction in comparison to the negativities he points out further afield. And yet, it's plausible why this must be the case, and as such, without evidence, I don't argue that Jiang is consciously an asset of or even a particular advocate for the CCP, although the formal question of such connection remains open to me. Still, this grey area he cannot but stand in reminds us of something about our current moment. The West is fracturing, the global order is becoming more chaotic, and the zeitgeist is calling in diversities of voice, both in the sense of where that voice speaks from, as well as the interpretive what it brings to the field. Jiang is also well placed to appeal to Western and indeed English-speaking voices from across the world because a great many things are becoming increasingly clear to more and more people. The manifest truth of Western and global elite corruption, the spiritually and culturally emaciating effects of consumerist individualism, alienation from community and deep-rooted collectivity, magnified by techno-capital and predatory finance, which subject working populations all across the empire to function as precarious cattle machines, increasingly divorced from place and participation in community-level production of material and meaning. Our energy is all too easily captured by the corporation, the digital, the state, and siphoned by interests whose objective is control without care for the long-term vitality of the context of belonging they extract from. There's plenty more. The time to speak truth to power is very much upon us, though you might have to open a support ticket to do so. Prove your humanity to a robot first. Navigate some bullshit until someone basically powerless, bound to more bullshit by their income and exhaustion, gets back to you. They might even do so with a hint of resentful frustration at your bringing too much human into the coercive constraints of the machine they'd rather not admit to serving. Too much subject for the system, a la Cadell last in the book Systems and Subjects. Or we could vote better. I guess. Not so sure about that. Interestingly, it might be that Jiang's very position in China protects him to speak a great deal of truth to power, though not, of course, to the Chinese. There's little doubt he must toe the line, be careful about naming too many names, keep his influence focused outward. But is it not the case that more and more people in the so-called West are waking up to just how much we toe the line with our speech? That there are only more and more stark instances of speech being conditioned? Lines we are conditioned and coerced to stay within? Lines we condition and coerce ourselves and each other to stay within? Western propaganda used to benefit from an advantage that for the majority voter base within its remit, the dream of a relatively prosperous life compared to others on the fringes of empire was genuinely something of a material possibility. As certain dimensions of this dream fade further and further away, and as even the man who played lead in The Pursuit of Happiness himself slaps a clown for joking on stage, the ruling elites have a natural incentive to pervert the cultivation of an increase in revolutionary consciousness. Sadly, our culture in general is quite capable of cooperating in this endeavor, as political theorist Benjamin Studebaker describes well in many ways, and in particular by reference to his 4 F's of faith, family, fandoms, and futurism. But at least at the level of intra-elite conflict, a la Peter Turchin, there appears to be a desire to propagate tales of the naked debaucheries of the emperor and his cronies. Those other emperors, surely, not us or ours. Thus, I think we can recognize that Jiang will find more than just political alignment with echelons across the Isles, for everyone can make an enemy of corruption and criminality when it suits them. There's also evidence, I think, at least at the level of increasingly salient narrative, a growing openness and attraction to the attentional value of revolutionary subjectivity in general. I don't say that this is enough for deeply meaningful change. In fact, I've said that Jiang may well prove another sink for this energy, rather than a cultivator of more generative, participatory understanding and activity. But I do think he is a sign that the zeitgeist is wanting to undergo some kind of solve et coagula at the level of interpretation, a dissolution and recoagulation. And he is, I think, something of a catalyst in that process. How captured that context of dissolution and recombination is, again, the natural question. It's probably quite captured. But to my gut, only quite. Significantly, yes, but not totally. I do think there are cracks of potential opened by shifts in narrative and mass formations of attention. Whether those cracks are only to widen the gyre and increasingly isolate reality and communication from itself in the turning, remains for me a question worth living a response to. Speculative prediction justified by some faux denial of influence in the world is a shield from real contact. And there is something instructional in this, for mass attention loves to pause, though only just for a precious, fleeting moment. In the crack where frequency shifts, the trance breaks, and consciousness opens to creativity. Chapter 7. Mass Attention. The Prospects of Encounter. Before closing, there's a point to raise in Jiang's favor. As Tom Lyons observed in a conversation 2 weeks ago, shared along with this essay, there is a sense in which Jiang does appear open to encounter, or at least, in my view, a certain form of encounter. I believe there is sincerity in his testimony that seeking out and engaging ideas which are different from one's own is important. I can go along and accept the story he tells of his developing understanding over the years, that he cares for the education and experience which afforded him that learning, that he wants to, quote, ignite the divine spark in people. As I said earlier, he is ready and willing to stand and deliver, to meet questions, including critical questions, head on. But I've also said that there are likely important limitations to the kind of participation that Jiang evokes, despite his stated intentions. So there's something to clarify here. On the kind of willingness to stand and deliver an encounter, there is nothing revolutionary about this from the perspective of public intellectual voices interacting in the so-called marketplace of ideas since the long-form revolution of the mid-2010s. Indeed, one of the trademark signs of attentional value today is precisely this sense that a speaker is willing and able to address almost all angles of any critical topic. This is both a strength and a weakness of the medium in general. On the one hand, there is an attentional forcing function to keep the affect of epistemic authority flowing. This builds fragility into the context of shared understanding itself, as authoritative pronouncements across more domains than most listeners can validate, ground, or challenge perpetuates a kind of inbred narrative closure or self-referentiality of maps, which are prone to obscure their epistemic weaknesses behind the additive experience of coherence that results from repetitions of apparent internal consistency plus completion, while eyes are bowed or distracted from genuine engagement with novelty, difference, or otherness. This is a critical weakness. For a whole book's worth of comprehensive philosophical exploration of this important context of thought, see the brilliant work of O.G. Rose in general, and The Map is Indestructible in particular. Yet, on the other hand, there is a strength, namely that if audience perception is astute, we are able to attend to how less well-supported domains of knowledge are employed in service of the various grander narratives and provocations being made. There is an opportunity in attending to these areas of comparative epistemic lack. We can gain insight into the contours of influence a voice brings to the zeitgeist. An example of this can be found in Cadell Last's analysis of the relationship between Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Jordan Peterson in his powerful book Real Speculations. In this, Last applies a Hegelian lens to the various movements and fixities of spirit throughout the registers of reason, spirit, and religion, Dawkins, Harris, and Peterson respectively. And I do think these kind of encounters support movement in the cultivation of collective perception. But it takes a great collective effort of work to cultivate the networks and contexts of learning and communication to more directly engage such movements with sufficient, sustained, intentional attention, to engage the real as well as speculation. But can we realistically expect or ask any more of Jiang than this in the present era of attention? He is already a voice for ideas which are stimulating above-the-fold attentional discourse. And the humbling, sobering, even humiliating thing is that although the algorithm can to some degree be hacked, the elements of its bias and chaotic neutrality partially gamed, and collective attention itself variously primed and conditioned, spirit pacified, there is also a certain reality, a measure of our own complicity, some conflux of unmet need, desire, and drive which animates the subject behind the retention curve. So for the sake of our own emancipatory spirit, as well as biologic connection to the brute swipe of every thumb, we must recognize that we, collectively, enact some genuine preference which the algorithm is bound to follow, for it seeks at least to maximize engagement in service of capital. I don't think that's all that's going on, but whatever is going on, we are involved. Nevertheless, where we might wish to challenge and invite Jiang to attend is the following, for he, as a being, is also a participating influence, somewhere amidst the reificatory, more or less deifying, demonizing, dehumanizing functions of mass attentional prominence. That is, to encourage his partners in discourse to attend to the very desire they have and share in arriving at the conversation, to bring into address the very context of attention for which they are selecting content, in addition to the kind of speech they are optimizing for. I'm not talking about basic self-narrative, justification of story, or positioning of the game board. I'm speaking about a sincere encounter with the pressures and tensions of truth and question that appear in our desire for becoming and relationship, beyond the superegoic constraints on thinking as ordinarily imposed by the social, institutional, or audience group-captured mind. From what I've seen, the depth psychological and psychoanalytic is a notable lack in Jiang's reference base. But there might be hope for a basic humility and authenticity of truth-seeking which, for a time, may add value to the attentional commons. Now, I think it's fair to say that doing such, at least today, would be unlikely to sustain the scale of collective attention which is the principal factor of admission to the stage above the fold, the content you scroll less to find. But nevertheless. Additionally, I don't suggest that the comprehensiveness and integrity of encounter worth cultivating today will be attained in the mere voicing of conditioning factors that colour and tone the attentional medium, although I have more to report from my own work on this than I can speak to here. For a start, the quality of participation in encounter we need more of is a matter as much of field cultivation as it is the work of a more vigilante-style cowboy. However, even within the frame where we imagine what influence the so-called individual actor may have on the attentional stage, without asking for said actor to draw awareness to the hulking elephant that is the medium's effect on the context of communication itself, there remain more aspirational modes of engagement we might hope to see more of. One such mode is simply the contribution of a relatively pure presentation of, at least elements of, the zeitgeist to itself. Perhaps there remains a genuine authenticity, sincerity, purity, however coloured in modes of delivery, which might in their own way be problematic or lacking, that does still help us see more of the evolving reality we inhabit. This is, in a way, a very simple point, and of course the value of such authentic speech can encounter a quick limit on its shine as the pressure of grift, political handling, audience capture, and zero-sum debate identity needs start to catch. The more captured a culture warrior or grifter, the more undead, repetitive, pressure-building influence gets added to discourse. We can track contributions to the zeitgeist from such types as much or more so by what content they occlude than they include. And as intimated earlier, we'd be prudent to apply the same concern for what goes unspoken, hidden, or ignored in Jiang's discourse. But I do think the contours of more personal confessions to the zeitgeist, especially when they appear to be called forth by the zeitgeist itself, allow us an angle of perception into shifts in collective consciousness today, or at least the movement of narrative. In contrast, I see the impulse to grift as more of a recursion to, or capitalization on, already energized narratives in the zeitgeist, rather than an embodiment of something closer to the crystallization of a coherence vector in the field of collective thought. So if Jiang is in fact open to encounter, at least in the altogether minimal sense of a sincere and authentic meeting in the marketplace, then he'll likely prove a meaningful signal to track in terms of understanding the short, medium-term evolution of narrative in the zeitgeist. And in making the observations he does, he is radically increasing the absolute number of observations on the more shadowed elements of the system we participate in. Can those observations enact of themselves some semblance of systemic perturbation? The algorithm in the context of digital attention is one mechanism through which they might do something, risks to ignorance and impotence-making notwithstanding. Jiang's hook on attention will be reinforced by this mechanism for the time in which his voice resonates, or until such time as the observations he makes are no longer effectual in nudging new material, or at least material that is newly constellated with the salience of the revelatory, into zeitgeist-ready consumption. Naturally, he could also fall prey to grift, intentionally or unintentionally. So I hope he has good friends, for those reasons and more, as mass attention loves conflict, kayfabe, and a kind of self-reflection or self-mirroring that tends toward progress through implosion, yes, but also the collapse of those who stay too long constellating some novelty of awareness within the storm's eye. Chapter 8. Onward Questions. I close with questions that circle beneath this essay. They are questions which Voicecraft and my work in general take seriously. How does all of the above condition the prospects for, constraints on, and capacities to genuinely participate in the becoming and return of psyche, culture, and nature. And secondly, as relates to the invocation of encounter, I often reserve this term for a particular metaphysical meaning as it relates to the presentation of anomaly in the field of awareness. That is, the very predicament for orientation which at some level of aesthetic and ethical awareness I call discernment on the way, and which more systematically, I endeavour, shows up with the modes of orientation which we adopt in contact with other as an occasion of onto-epistemic contact. These are breadcrumbs to previous conversations or onward thinking for anyone interested enough to be reading at the end, but I offer them to clarify the depth. These are breadcrumbs to previous conversations or onward thinking for anyone interested enough to be reading or listening at the end, but I offer them to clarify the depth to which I at least feel obligated to ground the meaning of encounter. Nevertheless, in the context of this essay, I ask, how might we better approach encounters with each other and the various cracks and fractures in the rocking of our age, so that thought can be up to the task of understanding? How might we alter states of conversation to support the sharing of more meaning, more context, more story, more art, more rigor, more voice, more presence, more purpose, more receptivity, more reality, more of what matters in the process of understanding? And with a lot less loft than all of that, what may be in the adjacent possible for above-the-fold attention today that could inspire more genuine participation? Discernment on the way.